Hey everybody, welcome. I'm Chris Quinones. I am a licensed massage therapist and Ayurvedic health counselor and practitioner here in Colorado Springs. And I help people manage their chronic pain naturally and maintain pain-free mobility well into their 80s and beyond. I'm a competitive athlete, yogi, and I really help coach people through redesigning their lives for natural healing and for stepping into their fullest potential. And tonight I'm joined by Orion Aon from Forage, Colorado, who is going to be sharing with us some basic tips on how we can increase our conscious relationship to plants and why we should be interested in developing that relationship to plants, how we can cultivate a deeper sense of nourishment and self healing, and also planetary thrive as well. So, welcome, Orion. Welcome, Brenda, and everyone else who's maybe watching or joining this in replay. Um, Orion, I'm fairly new to this idea of bringing wild invasives, native plants into my daily diet. I've been practicing and studying yoga and Ayurveda now for over 20 years. And for not until recently was I even considering more than the kale and the spinach on my plate, thinking I was pretty good with the amount of greens I was getting. Why are these native species and the interest in weeds becoming more important now, do you think? And how did you get into this?
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to our in-person thing a little later in the spring. Um, so I'll start with how I got into it. I have always been outdoorsy. Grew up hiking, fishing, those sorts of things. And when I was about 10, a family friend offered to take my dad and myself and my brother out mushroom hunting.
Mm-hmm.
And that trip was sort of like the switch that flipped. It's like, oh, this is interesting. There's food out here. And that trip kind of became an annual thing that we would do going up into the mountains during mushroom season. Some years were better than others.
How old were you when you had that kind of first aha moment that food could be found like outside your kitchen?
I don't know that the like the wild food thing really clicked until later, but this sort of like intrigue and treasure hunt of going out and finding wild mushrooms was what really kind of got me started down that path. Um, the wild food thing clicked a little later when I started providing, I'm a meat eater as well. And so providing meat from the wild and sort of like, oh, I can incorporate all these sources of food that's organic and healthy, and I know exactly how it was treated. I know where it came from. I know how it was processed. Um, and that's when it started like sort of clicking where I could kind of, if I tried really hard, incorporate all sorts of wild ingredients into my diet and almost, solely eat stuff that I gathered, hunted, or grew. And so that's kind of what got the ball rolling on just like pulling all of those wild sources in. But yeah, the path was started by that mushroom hunt, when I was 10 or 11, just going out and, you know, the mountains of northern New Mexico where I grew up and just like, oh, wow, all these like edible mushrooms are out here that you can just pick and bring home and preserve and, have for the next year, dried or frozen. And so that's what really got me started. And as to why, I think you mentioned something about how it's maybe important or becoming more commonplace. There's a lot of facets to that question and that idea. One, I think a lot of people have become more interested in wild foods and foraging in the last couple of years with the pandemic. There was some food scarcity, there was some supply chain issues, there was some concern about health. And there's also a mixture of wanting to get out into the outdoors more. So all of those things kind of like, oh, well, I can do all of that with foraging. And I may even, be able to do it in my backyard. So that's a big portion of it. And then the other portion is there's a movement to be more sustainable and eat healthier, get away from kind of monocultures and factory farms and traditional farming, and grow your own stuff and provide your own food. And I think that interest is also kind of pushing people towards eating the plants and wild foods around them.
Yeah, certainly as we in the wellness world circles of individuals who are really invested in you know learning more about the food chain and where their food comes from, how it's been processed, what the energetic effects and post digestive effects of the substances, and how we can use it as medicine. I know that when we talk about nutrients and nourishment, when I talk to my clients about nourishment and nutrients, um, even if we're eating really freshly prepared organic food, the issue of our topsoil seems to limit the density of nutrients that we can actually provide and grow right now. And that the invasive weeds or plants seem to have deeper root systems that can maybe withstand some of the abuse of the topsoil or loss of the topsoil that we're experiencing now. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the correlation between that and the nutrient density of food?
Yeah, that kind of goes back to the monoculture thing, and I don't study in depth on like the nutrient contents of these wild plants. It's obvious that they're more nutrient dense because they're wild. That's just sort of the plants that are grown in a kind of a traditional farm sense are fed fertilizer and essentially grown in what has become a lifeless substrate. In traditional non-organic farming, they have to spray for pests, and that generally kills the soil, and year after year they're planting in that soil, and so it becomes pretty much just a dead substrate that they subsidize with fertilizer and manure and those sorts of things. um, Whereas wild plants have to survive on their own, right? They have to make big roots, they have to get their resources where they can, and so that leads to them just having more nutrients in them. Um, the the root deeper root thing can vary. If it's an annual plant that doesn't need to have a big root system to stick around for the following years, it's going to have a shallow root system, and it'll just produce a lot of seeds, and that's how it propagates. But a perennial or a biennial, um, like a dandelion maybe, those are going to have big tap roots to get deep into the soil, get those nutrients, get that water. And so that's kind of where that idea can come into place. And I was actually just cleaning some dandelion roots this morning, and I had some that were about a foot long, and still I had cut them, so you can see how deep they go if you've ever tried digging dandelions before.
I haven't. No, I'm still very new to the invasives and branching out beyond the kale.
Yeah.
That so in Ayurvedic medicine we say bitter is better in
Uh-huh.
terms of the taste of our food. And certainly with the modern lifestyles we live and the kind of environmental toxins that we take in on the daily, our livers collectively are pretty underperforming now. And so bitter is better. And to branch out with some of these kinds of species is the name of the game in the holistic realm, to giving yourself a natural detox
Mm-hmm.
that's safe and sustainable for our livers and our gallbladders and some of these fire organs, as we would say, that do the detox of those
Yeah.
cellular repair. um, What's coming up now this time of year? Is anything coming up yet that we can
we're
go
we're
on?
just getting started, late winter or fall, early winter, fall, and late winter, spring are kind of root season. You can dig roots out the whole cold season, of perennials like dandelions, because the inactive, you can dig them whenever, but it's better to do it in the winter-ish time because they're holding all of their sugars and nutrients in their roots to get ready to grow for the following season, versus digging them in the summer when they've got flower and they've put all their energy into leaf and flower production. So that's why you would dig roots this time of year. But we're just, with this warm weather we're having, we're kind of just getting into the greens starting to come up. So these dandelion roots that I'm digging have tiny little leaves on them, and we're starting to see some grasses start to grow, which isn't something that I would eat, but that generally suggests that the greens are going to be following. So, I would say in the next probably 2 weeks, if the weather trends continue, we'll start seeing some of the earlier greens. And, through April and into May, it's wild green season. And it's kind of a forager's, favorite time of year because they've gone all winter without these wild greens that they're sort of their body starts craving.
Yeah, this intuitive part of ourselves, knowing as an organism, the shift of our environment is upon us, that we're tuning into that kind of innate wisdom of craving what the body needs for this time of year.
Yeah.
To maximize our immune capacity, to maximize our ability to handle stress, to mitigate chronic silent inflammation and pain, and so much of what people are needing help with, that are largely rooted now in autoimmune dysfunction,
right,
that we see so much of. So what are some of your favorite early greens, and how do you like to prepare them?
So I always harvest dandelion roots this time of year, but I like those mostly for either coffee. It's I'm sure you've heard of either chicory or dandelion coffee, at least. And that's just drying the
From
roots.
the root, not the leaves or
It's
flowers.
from the root. Yeah, you dry it and then roast it, and then you can grind it, and it's a coffee-like drink. It doesn't have any caffeine, but it tastes pretty similar with that chocolatey roasted bitterness from the roots. And so I always harvest some of that this time of year. And then, another one that
How much root do you need to produce like a pot of coffee?
It depends on how strong you like it, but I would say like an equivalent, maybe 70% equivalent amount of coffee that you would use for a pot of coffee could be the same amount of dandelion root. And then you can kind of adjust to the flavor that you like. I generally will just make like a cup with like a tablespoon of grounds.
I see.
Yeah, but they're so prevalent that if you're willing to put in the work, you can kind of get, as much as you want, and nobody's going to care that you're digging up dandelions because most people don't like them.
Right. How do
You
you
just
know
have to.
that the soil is safe to dig from?
Yeah, that's what
Like
kind of.
dandelions is pretty abundant, right? So
Kind of what I was going to mention is, you have to kind of pick and choose where you'll get the dandelions. Generally, I'm digging in either my own yard or places where I know are safe, and that's kind of the best bet for those sorts of things. If you're trying to venture out and find them, you could always ask, if it's like a managed area. But for the most part,
managed meaning is it sprayed with
right,
pesticides or yeah.
right,
And
yeah.
who would you ask that? Like you're just local forestry or BLM or
yeah, park service, or if it's a city park, a park manager. But for those sorts of weedy plants, I would look more towards your local gardens, your community gardens, your friends and neighbors, people that have a yard, and you can ask them, how do you manage your weeds? And would you mind if I dug up some dandelions, or came and harvested some of these, or helped you weed your garden? And most of the garden weeds are actually really good edible plants. So
Other than dandelion.
other than dandelions, yeah, dandelions are great too. But
Can you give us a few examples?
sure, yeah. One of my favorite garden weeds that's super common is called purslane,
Mm-hmm.
and it's has one of the highest amounts of omega-3s in the plant world.
Really?
Yep. It also has some oxalic acid, so you can't eat too much of it raw,
Mm-hmm.
but it's lower in it than some plants, and many of the plants we eat, regularly or have oxalates. So it's kind of more of a concern for someone who might be predisposed for kidney stones.
Right.
Those
right.
oxalates can collect and
Right.
be an issue for that. But yeah, very high in omega-3s, super common. If you have it, you have lots of it. It's an annual that self-seeds regularly, and it also can grow from a piece of itself very, very easily. So most people have it in their gardens.
Nice.
Aside from that, there's lamb's quarters is another very common one. Amaranth, red-rooted amaranth.
Mm-hmm.
Lamb's quarters is a relative of quinoa, but the greens are very similar to spinach, and I prefer them to spinach. Actually, they have a little more flavor and more nutrition. What else?
You prepare the leaves in a dehydrator and powder them and keep them like as your homemade green powders?
You can do that. Yep. You can blanch and freeze them. So a quick dip in boiling water, and then squeeze the water out and freeze them like that. You
wouldn't do like a cold ice dunk after the blanching. You would
you
just
can do that. Yeah, either way is fine. Yeah, if you want to shock them to cool them off, that's totally fine too.
Yeah.
Or just eat them raw.
Or just eat them raw.
Yeah, I like to cook a lot of my spring greens just because I get more of them. There's only so much raw salad I can eat, but I can eat a lot more cooked greens, and you get a lot more because they kind of cook down a little bit. But there's some people that prefer not to cook them because there is some loss of some of their compounds when you cook stuff. But yeah.
And what are the must-have tools one must have as a beginner forager? Is it just like a basket and a pair of like scissors and gloves, maybe? And a good trail
it
guide?
really depends on what you're after and when. You can go out with nothing, but maybe a small bag to put stuff in. If you're going to be kind of just generally foraging and you have the knowledge, maybe some gloves in case you run into stinging nettle or something with thorns. I usually bring a small pair of like herb scissors with me, and I like to use cloth bags. Generally, if I'm going to be out like for a long time, I'll bring a cooler maybe to keep greens fresh. But if your greens that you're harvesting get wilty, you can always just put them in cold water for 30 minutes when you get home, and they'll regain that turgor pressure that they've lost.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's really the best tool is knowledge when it comes to starting to forage. If you start getting into it, it can seem very overwhelming because there's just so many resources. There's so many different edible plants. I mean, I think there's something like 300,000 species of edible plants in the world, roughly, maybe more.
That we know.
So
yeah,
that we know of. So trying to think of that is just like, mind blowing. So you kind of have to parse it down to, okay, how am I going to get into this? What am I going to focus on? And generally what I recommend is picking, like maybe 5 to start with. And if that's too much, maybe 3. And if 3 is too much, then just start with 1. But pick a few and try to learn their qualities, their traits, what they look like when they're young, what they look like when they're in flower, what they look like when they've gone to seed and are dying. And really understand, where they grow and their kind of lifespan, essentially. And once you become familiar with the plant, And that process can take minutes, it can take hours, it can take years, depending on the species and your confidence in your ability to gain pattern recognition. Because foraging really comes down to pattern recognition. Can you recognize what this plant looks like, in the mix of all the other plants? And the more you do it, the better you get at it. So, something like a dandelion, pretty much everyone knows how to identify, but there are some plants that kind of look like dandelion that maybe people don't think about. So a wild lettuce, which is also edible, might confuse you for a dandelion if you're just getting started. Right. So kind of understanding, what other plants might I see that look sort of like it, and what traits might differentiate these plants from their similar ones, even if the similar ones are edible. It's good to kind of practice that ability to separate similar looking plants. And everyone can go about this a different way. Generally, what I recommend is studying lots of pictures and taking lots of pictures. Pretty much everyone has a decent camera in their pocket nowadays. So, there's no harm in snapping a few pictures of a plant that you find interesting or that you want to learn more about, and taking it home and pulling it up and researching it online, or using, an app. I don't recommend people to rely on the apps, but they can at least get you started towards identifying a new plant. Maybe send it to a friend who is experienced, or send it to me if you're comfortable with that. I'm always happy to take a look at pictures if I have time. And then books are something that, I obviously have many of, and those are all foraging books behind me.
Do you have a favorite title or, resource or ID book you recommend?
Yeah, so for plants, always my first recommendation are Samuel Thayer's books. He has 3 right now. They're for all of North America, so they're not, regionally specific. But in terms of Colorado, the plants they cover, probably 70 or 80% are in Colorado. So it's a pretty good coverage, and you also learn some plants that you may find on your travels or elsewhere in North America.
And that's Thayer, Theyer.
Thayer. Yeah. I can even grab them and show them off, but they're Forager's Harvest is his first one. Nature's Garden is his second, and Incredible Wild Edibles is his third. And each book is maybe 40-ish plants. They go very in depth. They're plants that he's known for many years. He has a ton of experience, and he always has really interesting stories about them. He goes over all the identifying traits, and they're very fun to read. They're not dry books. Sometimes the descriptions of plants, the botanical descriptions, can be a little dry if you're not into that, but his stories are always entertaining, and he has just a great way of kind of teaching you through writing. So those are always my first recommendations. And then once you get comfortable with, those, and you want to start branching out, the options are limitless. So you can kind of pick and choose from there. And I have a whole list on my website, Forage Colorado, if people want to take a look at some other options as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. For those of you listening tonight, we've got a live in-person event on April 9th, Saturday, here in Colorado Springs at Palmer Park, where Orion and I are going to be leading you on a plant identification walk locally to see what is available and coming up through the ground. And so if you're interested in registering for that, I'll put a link for that in the chat, or you can go to my website at rasa, RASA Yana, YANA.com. And we'll get you squared away for the afternoon. That'll be a relatively mild hike and walk through a path in Palmer Park, and for about 2 to 3 hours. And we'll just have a nice afternoon of it. So
be ready to be overwhelmed with plant knowledge.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And I love the plants. What can we do to show our love for plants now? Just as everyday citizens, maybe beginner foragers, how do we help the soil recover? What are some small things that we can do in our mindful practice to connect again and raise that level of consciousness?
Yeah. So there's an interesting way to think about that question. When it comes to foraging, most of the greens and the plants that we're after this time of year are either not native or are invasive, right? So by foraging some of those, you might actually be giving back to the native plants that could be struggling. So if you look at it in that way,
Mm-hmm.
you're removing possibly damaging species, whatever that means. There are actually species that are invasive and damaging that are edible. So there's that aspect of it. And then as far as just kind of generally giving back, being respectful of where you're going, um, not trampling on everything, maybe picking up some trash if you're in an area that has some trash, and just gaining some kind of respect for the resource, right? Not digging up every dandelion you find, not picking every green of a species you find, just kind of selectively harvesting, leaving some to go to flower and go to seed and continue to spread, their future generations. But like I said, this time of year, it's really about the invasives. And many of these species have naturalized. So they've kind of become common and almost as a native species in urban areas mostly. And we could probably talk for another 20 minutes about this, but it's kind of an interesting story in that these plants most of them were brought here by settlers. They had these plants that they grew in Europe, and they were their food and medicine over there. And they came to this new world, and they weren't familiar with all the plants, so they brought them and planted them, and those plants have escaped and naturalized and outcompeted in some cases our native plants. And so, we're sort of taking advantage of that, like historical introduction, essentially. And there's, like I said, we could talk a whole lot more about this, but there's some interesting examples, like you can find wild horseradish and rhubarb that was planted from miners in the mountains of Colorado at old homesteads. You can find old cabins with these medicinal plants around them.
Right. I mean, we have these ghost towns from the mining era here, and
Mm-hmm.
to think of these plants that are designed to thrive in harsh conditions or adapt in harsh conditions
Yeah.
would still be available.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes
So
sense.
the way that I generally like to give back is just gaining a respect and appreciation for these. By learning about them, you're going to care about them more, and so you're just sort of going to inherit an appreciation and a care for these things. It's instead of walking down the street and saying, being completely ignorant of what's around you, you're like, oh, I know this tree, I know these plants, I know those weeds growing up in the crack there, I appreciate those. I
Yeah,
don't think they're damaging, I think they're beautiful.
absolutely. I feel like there's also therapeutic value in connecting with these kinds of ancestral skills,
Mm-hmm.
right? And tools of how to identify plants and how to collect them, preserve them, administer them. And how do we actually co-mingle
Yeah.
with consciousness that will heal ourselves and the planet? So
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us. For those that want to know more about our work or more about the plant walk, you see some links in the chat there. Feel free to reach out. I'm happy to schedule a complimentary strategy call, and we'll just find out what your mind body goals are and what tools are available, maybe in your own backyard, that you can start with right away to feel better, to be pain free, to be mobile into your 80s and beyond. So, thanks so much for joining, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks.
Bye bye.